Good afternoon and welcome to the USDA Reconnect Virtual Post-Award Workshop on Construction Procedures. My name is George Egoke. I am one of the branch chiefs, engineering branch chiefs with USDA Rural Utilities Service. My co-presenter today will be Mr. Shekinah Pepper. He's one of our general field representatives. I will cover the first 4 bullet points in today's agenda, and we will take 10 to 15 minutes near the end of the session to answer questions. To ask any questions, please type in the text box at the bottom, then click the Send Question button or hit Enter on your keyboard. Even though we won't address all questions until after the presentation, please feel free to submit questions throughout the session. We will answer them as long as time allows. A recording of this session and relevant materials will also be made available on our website in the coming days. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today, I will be going over a high-level review on our Reconnect Program Construction Procedures Guide. For everyone on this attending this workshop, if you're an awardee, you would have received a copy of that guide with your award documents. During this presentation, we will be reviewing construction procedures, some of the general requirements, and some standard RUS contract documents. General guidelines. RUS, all work must be performed and must conform to the application that was approved by RUS. If there are changes, those changes would have to be submitted to RUS for review and approval consideration. Construction must not commence until all environmental conditions are concluded. Also, all award-funded materials and equipment must comply with Buy American provisions in 7 CFR 1787. Additional requirements include the bonding requirement, which you find details, 7 CFR 1788, which calls for any construction projects in excess of $250,000 must be bonded, with minor exceptions. Surety companies are also listed and on a website maintained by the Department of Treasury. These sureties are the only acceptable sureties on our RUS funded program, including the Reconnect program. Title clearance. If there is if there's any building construction and that building construction is over $250,000, the evidence of the title clearance must be approved by RUS before the building contract will be approved. On software licenses, as part of equipment purchase, the original manufacturer may require the awardee enter into a software license agreement for the use of this equipment. In that instance, that software license agreement will be included in the equipment contract. For the Reconnect program, RUS contract forms may be used, and awardees may also elect to use non-RUS contract forms. However, if non-RUS contract forms are used, a draft copy of that form would need to be approved by RUS before the contract is executed. On tower construction, if you're proposing to build towers, the RUS, the standard RUS Form 773 contract may be used, or awardees may elect to use a non-standard contract that has been approved by RUS. Funds will be encumbered on the FRS and advanced on the FRS for these 773 contracts. All other 773 contracts will be funded under small-scale construction, small-scale advanced procedures. And I believe my colleague, Ms. Fawa Nakui, went over those procedures in detail yesterday. There are limits for small-scale construction projects, and those limits vary by type of projects. Most notably, the limit for outside plant construction projects is $1 million. For equipment procurement and building construction, the small scale limit would be $100,000. Prior RUS approval is required to amend any contracts if any of these 4 conditions listed here apply. So whether it be a standard RUS contract that was used or a non-standard RUS that was used, if there are terms in the contract that are changing, if the conditions are changing, if the scope of work changes, if the price increases by over 20% or more, or if the price makes the contract require a performance bond, which means if the price was initially below the 250,000 threshold, and the amendment requires that price go up to and exceed $250,000, prior RUS approval is required. For non-RUS contracts, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, that RUS approval of the contract form is required prior to contract execution. It must include a provision that the contract is non-binding on the parties until RUS approval has been granted. Now, RUS will not approve a non-RUS contract if the work covered is not in the approved application, or if the work covered is not an eligible purpose. If the terms and conditions are vague, inadequate, or unreasonable, or if the contract presents unacceptable loan security risk to RUS. Affiliated transactions. Affiliated transactions are defined in the agreement, and I will not bother to go over reading this word for word. However, if an awardee would like to enter into an affiliated transaction, I suggest that they contact their GFR and start that conversation very early. Because there are some documents that will need to be sent to RUS for review and approval purposes before such transactions can be permitted. All affiliated transactions will be lower of cost or market rate, subject to RUS verification. For closeouts, to close out construction contracts, the standard RUS form closeout forms will be required for RUS contracts. A non-RUS closeout form will need to be created for non-standard, for non-RUS contracts. That closeout, the non-RUS closeout form, will also need to be reviewed by RUS as part of the drafts that have been submitted if an awardee elects to use non-RUS contracts. Records. All records must be maintained by the awardee and retained until they are audited and approved by RUS. So these records will be required for all expenditures, and that includes both grant, match, loans, and non-loan funds that are required for the Reconnect project. It will include contracts, include or not limited to contracts, third-party invoices, timesheets, payroll records, material records, overhead cost allocation records, summary schedules. Records must be retained until all facilities are permanently removed from service, all removal restoration activities are completed, and all costs are retired from the accounting records. For awardees, the field accountants will be contacting you as well as the general field rep to walk you through some of the accounting requirements. And if there are any questions, please reach out to your GFR and your field accountants, and they will be glad to assist you. Under the Reconnect program, there is no interim construction process. So construction can start once awardees are notified of the award and I'm stressing that, and all necessary environmental requirements have been concluded. The work that's performed prior to the release of funds, it's performed at the awardee's risk. If the time calls where the funds cannot be released for whatever reason, then RUS will not be funding any of the costs that were incurred prior to release of funds. There is a 5-year construction period, and that 5-year construction period starts when funds are released. And the release dates will be different or can be different for each award. Standard RUS contract documents. So RUS, on our website, we maintain copies of our standard RUS contracts. They are available to all awardees for use. For professional services, we have the 217 engineering contract, and we have the 245 miscellaneous services contract. For equipment purchases and equipment installation, purchase and installation, you have the RUS form 395. For building construction, we have the RUS form 257. For outside plant construction, we have the RUS 515. And for miscellaneous additions and small-scale construction projects, we have the form 773. The RUS form 282 is available for subcontracts, and the 238 is available for amendments. For closeouts, we have a number of forms that on here. You have the 287, the 506, which is the closeout form for engineering, and the 756, which is used to close out all equipment and outside plant projects. With that, we will go into professional services. And on here, we will talk about engineering, architectural, and other professional services that may be required for each Reconnect project. Awardee must obtain professional services from persons or firms that are not affiliated with any contractor, vendor, manufacturer, presently providing labor, materials, or equipment to the awardee. The engineer or architect must be registered in the state within which facilities or within which construction is going to take place. Prior RUS approval is required should the awardee intend to have their in-house engineering staff perform some professional services. I mentioned the affiliated services agreement earlier, that an affiliated services agreement will be required if an affiliate is involved, affiliate or subsidiary or related party. For professional services, we've subdivided this sections to when awardees are using outside consultants, using in-house staff, qualified staff, architectural services, and other professional services. So I did mention this a little bit earlier. For when using outside consultants, the 217 form is the standard RUS engineering services contract that is used. And when using for miscellaneous services, a 245 contract is used, and these are often for contracts that are funded, that are affiliated or related to small-scale construction projects. An awardee can also elect to use an approved non-RUS contract. For in-house engineering, the borrower, the awardee, in this case it could be grant or loan, must request RUS approval in writing to use in-house services. That request should be for any awardee that is thinking of using in-house staff. They should contact the GFR to make sure they are aware of some of the requirements that have to do with in-house engineering. Please note that given the prohibition on operating expenses and administrative costs, we have to have very detailed proposal that will show the detailed cost breakdown of these services, and the services have to be very specific as to what is going to be done. RUS will communicate what will be what will need to go in the engineering proposal based on the services that are submitted for review. For architectural services, the awardee may use the 220, the RUS Form 220, or use the RUS Form 217, or just create a non-RUS contract that will be submitted for prior RUS approval before the contract is executed. Architects must be licensed in the states where the facilities will be located. For other professional services, the 245 RUS form contract is available, or the awardee may elect to use an approved non-RUS contract. We have changed this process a little bit because right now for contract approval, there are three copies of the contracts that are executed. However, because we are working remotely now and because of the pandemic, we are asking that you scan a copy of the executed contract and email it to your GFR. The GFR will forward it to appropriate reviewers within the program, who will contact you if there are any questions or concerns. Similarly, on closeouts for professional services, you have the 284 form to close out architectural contracts. The Form 506 will be the closeout document for engineering contract. Similar certification will be required for non-RUS professional service contract, as well as the in-house engineering proposal once that's closed out. Equipment contracts. So equipment purchases, inclusive of installation costs that are under $100,000, can be purchased using purchase orders and reimbursed through the work order procedures. This all will be covered under small scale construction procedures. All supporting documentations for amounts shown on the Form 771A must be retained on file for RUS's review. My co-presenter will go into into greater details in upcoming slides. For equipment purchases, inclusive of installation costs exceeding $100,000, the 395 contract or approved non-RUS contract must be used. The 395 contract can be used for furnish only or furnish and install purposes. Equipment purchased under a contract that does not include installation may be installed by the awardee's own staff using work orders described under small scale construction procedures. And my co-presenter will be going into greater details in upcoming slides. Procurement methods. The engineer approves the plans and specs, the performance specifications, and the installation requirements along with the respective contracts and releases them to prospective suppliers. RUS recommends that at least 3 equipment quotes be obtained from different suppliers. However, awardees may elect to negotiate with a single vendor or with a single vendor. Grant awardees must comply with federal grant procurement guidelines in 2 CFR 200. Once a supplier has been selected, the awardee and supplier can enter into the contract. If you have any questions regarding the procurement process, please feel free to reach out to your GFR. This is a brief snapshot of the process, describing the process for equipment procurements and equipment installation, inclusive of installation costs. And it just summarizes what I just went over. If you have any questions, please feel free to, again, reach out to your GFR. So with that, I will hand over control to, I do have one more slide. I do apologize for that. Similar to the professional contracts, we ask that you send a scanned copy of the executed contract to the GFR, who will forward it to program staff, who will be reviewing them for approval purposes. And for equipment contracts, 756 form is the final closeout certificate for RUS contracts. And for non-RUS contracts, the awardee would have to create a similar closeout form that will be reviewed prior to the contract execution. I believe with that, that's truly the last slide. And with that, I will hand over to Mr. Pepper to take over.
Thank you, George. One of the things I also want to mention real quick is that if you have case-specific or project-specific questions on this, we do have office hours. Feel free to reach out to the staff. There's instructions in the PDF on how to do that, or you can reach out to your GFR to set up a meeting so that you can go over case-specific. Construction contracts, construction of outside plant facilities, buildings, and towers may be performed by an outside contractor or in-house work order. Outside contractor. awardee may execute an RUS 773, the form 257 or 515, and those are different forms that we can use, or we can use a non-RUS if you have a form that you already use for certain things, and you would like to continue with that contract. Just work with your GFR to get that in for approval, so that you can use that continuing forward with the project. RUS form 773. This is a pretty flexible form for what we use for both small scale construction and for our tower contracts. For this purpose, for small scale construction or miscellaneous construction work, we have $1 million limit on the contract for outside plant purposes. There's no limit on the amount of construction that can be done under the 773 in a year form, as long as each individual 773 is under $1 million. The awardee must attach all drawings, sketches, list of materials, units, description of work, standards and specifications, as well as certifications, so that it can go part of the contract. If you go through the Reconnect construction procedure guide, it actually outlines what needs to be done in each one of those to attach to the contract, so that you can have everything that you need here. If it exceeds $250,000, then it is required to have a contractor's bond. The awardee uses non-award funds to finance construction in progress and seeks reimbursement after work under the contract has been completed. So this is one that you fund up front, and then once you've completed the 773, then you'll submit that. We'll talk about that in a little bit. You'll submit that in for reimbursement and reimbursement for the full 773. There's no subcontracting allowed under 773s. And we'll talk about a little bit more if you've got a small scale, but there's going to be some subcontracting, how you can do that. Reimbursement procedures will also be covered a little bit later. And I believe that FAR will also talk about that yesterday. RUS Form 515 and 257 and non-RUS contracts. The engineer, whether that be an outside contractor or an in-house approved engineer, prepares the construction plans and specs, including any diagrams, sketches, tabulations necessary for specific work to be performed, along with the appropriate contract form, and release them to prospective contractors. We have had a number of people that also include an RFP type document that covers all of this and then has all of that included, and that's acceptable. All procurement transactions must be conducted in a manner to provide open and free competition to the maximum extent possible per 2 CFR 200. Contractors selected must meet all federal, state, and licensing requirements for your individuals. Construction contract, outside plant continued. Outside plant for OSP or outside plant projects, including all labor and materials estimated to exceed $1 million, awardees must use the 515 or a non-RUS contract. For outside plants, including labor and materials estimated at less, that's where you can use the 515 contract as well, or the 773. And there'll be another slide coming up that will kind of give you a Venn or a diagram to kind of show you your different options. When an awardee furnishes their materials under a Form 787 Supplement A to the construction contract, use RUS Form 515 or a non-RUS form written to accommodate. And the steps for owner furnished material as part of the contract are included in the construction guide. Plans and specs. Requirements for plans and specs are provided in the construction guide. For outside plant projects, including labor and material, estimated to exceed $1 million, plans and specs must be submitted to RUS for written approval. RUS will notify in writing if approval is withheld. Awardees can solicit bids or negotiate upon receipt of written approval for the instructions or per the instructions in the guide. Based upon also the type of money, there's some different things with negotiation in the different contracts, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. For outside plant projects, including all labor and materials estimated at $1 million or less, RUS approval of the plans and specs is not required. Procurement methods. General. Contact RUS if fewer than 3 bidders are qualified. Contact RUS if fewer than 3 valid bids are received. Awardee may award contract if all conditions in the guide, and the guide will take you through those conditions, are met. Then you can go out and award that contract. Prior approval is required to execute a contract if conditions in the guide are not satisfied, and that's when you kind of talk about you don't get 3 qualified bidders or valid bids, then you can contact us and we can walk you through that process. For outside plant projects, including labor and material, estimated to exceed $1 million, 100% loan awardees may solicit bids or negotiate upon written approval from RUS. RUS notification is required for negotiated contracts. Procurement methods: combination 50-50 loan grant awardees using loan funds or funds substituted for loan funds may solicit bids or negotiate upon receipt of written plans and specs approval. RUS notification is required for negotiated contracts, loan funds only. Prior RUS approval required to negotiate grant-funded contracts. And this is where you have to be careful on the 50-50. If you're in your loan funds, if that contract may go over into grant funds, that's where you have to be careful to make sure that you're getting prior approval if you negotiate. 100% of grant awardees may solicit bids upon receipt of written plans and specs approval. Prior approval is required to negotiate grant-funded contracts. Awardees using match funds may solicit or negotiate contracts. However, grant funds will not be funded or supplement such negotiated contracts. And that's where you got to be careful if you're right at the edge of your match funds versus the grant fund, if you're looking at a negotiated or solicited bid contract. For outside plant, including labor and material estimated $1 million or less, awardees may use the small scale construction or follow bidding negotiation procedures guide and use a 515 contract. For outside plant projects estimated to exceed $1 million, awardees must use the 515 or a non-RUS contract. For outside plant projects estimated $1 million or less, awardees may use the 515, a non-standard RUS contract, or the small scale constructions methods that we talked about, the 773. This is one of those guides that I kind of talked to you about, and this would be a great tool to kind of keep ready and handy. I think there's 5 of these diagrams through this presentation that would be useful to keep on hand in your office, just so you can kind of look through as you're going through your process to say, okay, is this project going to be $1 million? Is it going to be under $1 million? Do I need to have plans and specs approved? Do I need to go through RUS? Where does the approval process do? These slides really kind of help with that process, and it's something useful to have on hand. Contract closeout. Once all acceptance tests and inspections are completed and all deficiencies corrected, the awardee must obtain from the architect or engineer over the project RUS Form 756, contract closeout certification, or a similar certification for a non-RUS contract, and submit it to RUS within 30 days of contract completion. Documents required to close out RUS's outside plant contract Form 515 are listed in the Construction Procedures Guide. RUS will notify awardees in writing upon approval of final fees, permitting final payments to be made. Building construction. All construction pertaining to the building structure must be performed under a single contract. For buildings estimated to cost more than $100,000, RUS Form 257 or a non-RUS contract may be used. For unattended buildings estimated to cost over $100,000, a non-RUS contract must be used. For all building improvements and unattended buildings, such as huts or prefab buildings estimated to cost $100,000 or less, the RUS Form 773 small scale construction method must be used. Must comply with all applicable laws and regulations for the construction guide. Plans and specifications. Requirements for the plans and specifications are provided in the construction guide. When you're working through and developing your plans and specifications for approval, using the construction guide is a helpful tool to walk you through to make sure you have everything. All building plans and specs must be submitted to RUS for approval. Awardee can solicit bids upon receipt of that approval. Contract approval. Awardee must solicit bids for all building construction contracts. Contract awards is subject to conditions detailed in the construction guide. Once again, because of COVID, the 3 executed copies, what you'll do is you'll get the 1 executed copy and you'll email it to GFR. Until such time as we open back up our DC offices, we'll go back to probably the 3, and the GFR, your GFR will let you know when that time comes around. This is another one of those diagrams that kind of help you walk you through the process of, based upon the price, what are the different contracts that you can use and what are the different processes you have to follow. Contract closeout. Upon completion of construction per plans and specs, the awardee must obtain from the architect or the engineer, depending upon the project, RUS Form 756, contract closeout certification, or a similar certification for a non-RUS contract. Must be submitted to RUS within 30 days of completion. Documents required to close out RUS building contracts are Form 257. Once again, you have questions, trying to remember all these form numbers, reach out to your GFR. There's also a documents and forms website that we have that has all of this information on there. RUS will notify awardees in writing of approval of the final fees and allowing payment to be made. Tower construction. RUS Form 773, miscellaneous construction work maintenance service contract, or a non-RUS contract should be used to finance construction of all new and any improvements to existing towers. Plans and specifications. Requirements for the plans and specifications are in the construction guide. RUS approval is not needed for plans and specifications for tower contracts. Awardee should obtain at least 3 contractor proposals. Neither the selection nor the contractor, neither the selection of the contractor nor the proposal requires RUS approval. Contract approval. 3 copies of the Form 773. Once again, once you have this done during this time period, coordinate with your GFR to send that in, and he'll get to the appropriate division in DC for approval until such time as our DC offices open back up. And a contractor bond is required if the contract exceeds $250,000. For closeout, the awardee must obtain the RUS Form 756 contract closeout certification, or a similar certification for a non-RUS contract. And if you are looking at doing a non-RUS contract, make sure that you talk to your GFR and work with them on that contract and the different documents that need to go with that. And the sooner the better if you're going to look at going that direction, to make sure that there's not any slowdown in getting your documents approved by getting them in early to RUS for approval, for review of those non-standard or non-RUS contracts. RUS will notify in writing of approval of the final fees and allowing payment to be made. Tower contract diagram. Construction contract, subcontract and contract amendment. Non-RUS subcontracts can be used with non-RUS contract forms. RUS subcontract form 282 should be used with contracts 257, 395, and a 515. Once again, the 773 does not allow for subcontracts. Minor modifications to the subcontract form 282 is permissible, providing that they do not change the terms and conditions of the primary contract and are made per the construction procedures. RUS approval is not required per the Reconnect construction. RUS Amendment Form 238 for RUS Form 395 for equipment, and for buildings for 257, RUS Form 257. RUS Amendment Form 526 is used for the 515 outside plant contract. Non-RUS amendment forms can be used for non-RUS contract forms. Prior approval is only required if there are changes to the terms and conditions of the contract or the scope of the project. The amendment increases the contract price by more than 20%. The amendment causes an unbonded contract to require a performance bond. Once again, remember that $250,000. So if you're at 245 and an amendment pushes you over that 250, it requires a bond. It will require RUS approval. 3 copies of the executed, once again, not 3 copies at this time, 1 copy, email to your GFR for approval. In the future, if we go back to our offices being open, we'll address the 3 copies being sent into DC at that time, and your GFR will contact you. Small scale construction methods. Generally, the awardee finances small-scale construction with non-RUS funds and is reimbursed after the work is completed. The small-scale construction method may also be used in combination with other RUS contract forms or non-RUS contracts. RUS Form 773 method, third party, selected contractor meets all federal state licensing requirements. Work order method, in-house staff, and that's in-house staff is not the same as affiliated staff, even if it's under the same company umbrella. If it's an affiliated staff, that's a completely different process and you need to contact the GFR. But if they're actually in-house staff, daily timesheets, cost detail sheets, material reports must be kept. Cost accounting per 2 CFR 200 is applicable. And you can meet with your field accountant and your GFR to go over those procedures, make sure you have everything in place that is needed to keep those records. Used without modification for small scale construction, neither contract or selected contractor requires RUS approval. Contractor's bond required if more than $250,000. Upon construction completion and final inspection, awardee obtains a final invoice, an executed RUS Form 743 certificate of contractor and indemnity agreement. Certified RUS Form 771A and detailed work order description must be submitted to RUS for review upon completion of your 773 project. Work order means any work performed by the awardee's employees pursuant to its work order procedure, with the awardee furnishing all the materials, equipment, tools, and transportation. Work order construction must be performed to all local, state, and federal requirements. Awardee must keep daily timesheets and material reports referenced by work order project numbers to record labor, and cost accounting system must be in place to meet the requirements of 2 CFR 200 as applicable, to show the source of the summary of records to support requested and expended funds. The GFR does a physical inspection of some or all of the work order projects before initialing the work order form. 771A, when it comes in for funding, it'll go to the GFR for signature or for initial off. The GFR has the ability to review those projects prior to initialing off. So make sure that you're coordinating with your GFR in advance if you're getting ready to close out a work order process or small scale construction. Make sure that the GFR knows and can schedule a site visit if needed or if it's requested, so that we don't speed up or we don't slow down the process of getting that 771A reimbursement done. The GFR will also periodically audit and inspect the inspection of small scale construction projects to ensure the integrity of the closeout procedure. Certified Form 771A, the summary of work orders, is reviewed and initialed by the GFR, which is what I just went over. So when you're getting to that point and you're going to be submitting a work order for reimbursement, that is where you want to make sure the GFR knows you've got scheduled time as they're working different projects, so that they don't have to say, okay, I'm just going to take me a week or 2 weeks to get out to your project before I can initial off on the 771A. So you want to give them some advance notice that you're coming to the close of a work order or minor construction project if you're going to want them to sign off on that 771A. So once again, close coordination with your GFR is important. Awardee submits the Form 481 FRS along with the initialed 771A to RUS to request reimbursement for small scale and work order. So that's the summary of the slides. Now we'll move into some of the questions. We did get a question yesterday that has carried over today. Can we use materials already in stock? Fiber has a very long lead time, and we'll be performing the work ourselves. Owner-provided materials is accepted. However, you'd want to get with your GFR to make sure that they meet all the standards and conditions and requirements of RUS in order to receive reimbursement. There are some minor requirements that go along with owner-provided materials, such as new and non-depreciated assets, those kind of things. So work with your GFR on that specific question, but yes, owner-provided materials are. If I have multiple tower sites to construct and want to use a non-standard contract, do I have to get the non-standard contract approved for each tower construction, or can a single approval of non-standard form be allowed? If it is the same, and George, if you want to weigh in on this, go ahead. But if it is the same contract, you can, once you get the form approved for the first one, if it stays the same for the follow on, it's already been approved by RUS and you can use that same form. George, do you have any additional comment on that one that you'd like to chime in on?
Yes, you are indeed correct. I think you already answered the question, Shekinah. So once the draft contract is approved, that contract can be used for multiple projects as long as the terms or conditions in that approved contract do not change. If the terms and the conditions do change, then we need to go back and revisit and review the non-RUS contract again. However, the standard 773 contract is also available for awardees should they elect to use that and not have to come up with their own non-standard, non-RUS contracts.
Thank you, George. Does the USDA keep a list of qualified vendors, for example, vendors that sell common CPE equipment? I do not as a GFR. George, do you keep, or do you know if we keep a list of qualified vendors for common CPE equipment?
Yes, this is a very good question. RUS does not maintain a list of qualified vendors or even a list of materials. At this point, it is critical that the awardee works closely with a licensed engineer. The engineering firm will be the one not only preparing the plans and specifications, they also maintain a list of qualified contractors vendors that can be called upon to either bid on a project or supply quotes. But RUS does not maintain a list. Now, do keep in mind, Buy American applies. So the awardee is responsible for ensuring compliance with Buy American. And while we're on that topic, only those who are familiar with the supply chain, the equipment supply chain, can sign the Buy American certification. So a vendor who's not familiar with how a manufacturer produces its product cannot sign that Buy American certification. It has to come from the manufacturer itself. So it is critical that awardees work with their engineering firms, with licensed engineering firms, who are there to guide them and to assist in the process.
Excellent. Thank you, George. Next question. Our telephone company constructs our towers in-house. What kind of contract is necessary for that? In-house work orders, that is not done under contract, so it would be done under in-house work orders. The only contracts that you may need is going out and purchasing equipment is a 395. But when you're talking about in-house work orders and you're going out and actually constructing it, what you'll want to do is meet with your field accountant and your GFR to make sure you have all of the procedures, timekeeping, and those things in order so that when you're asking for reimbursement for the materials and the labor, that you can actually go through and get all of that submitted and pass the audit. So on that procedure, I would say reach out to your GFR who can set up a meeting with your field accountant to kind of go over the procedures for the work order process and make sure that you have everything understood on how to do that. But a contract is not needed for in-house. Next question. If a request is presented to RUS to negotiate, what type of reasoning is RUS typically looking at to approve those requests? I.e., we have a contractor who has been working on other projects in the same geographic area of our PFSA and would not have to redeploy equipment and resources. Plus, they have done other RUS projects for us in the past. This is a remote exchange several hundred miles from other contractors, so more likely save us time and money. We are 100% grant recipient. For fair and equal competition, we usually like to see projects bid out. However, if there is a reasonable need to negotiate based upon specific circumstances, part of the project, or it's all connected together, so you want to keep them moving on it, However, if there's two separate activities or two separate areas, if somebody's already out there, then they should be able to bid it cheaper and come in under bid. Now, George, I'd like for you to weigh in on this specifically, if you have any guidance on what kind of reasoning that you'd like to see in order to approve a negotiated contract versus a bid. However, I think from my perspective, it would be on a very case-by-case basis based upon specific details. Like you said, if your exchange is very remote, then that may be a contributing factor and reason for getting a negotiated. George, thoughts?
Thanks, Shekinah. I think you already addressed it. We are required to fund and document that we are funding cost-effective projects. So the default is generally bidding, and for grants, we ask that you review federal grant requirements into CFR 200, which also call for competitive bids. However, there is some cases that can be made for negotiations. Each case is unique. Each case is different. Case may be different. So if you present it, if it is reasonable and necessary, as long as it is well documented, our US will review the request for approval consideration.
Excellent. Next question. Would you recommend breaking a large contract into smaller phases to allow payment along the way as these phases are completed? So the 773 minor construction, $1 million or less, is the only the contract that you fund and then request reimbursement. Our 515 contract, you can actually draw down on that contract as you go. So if you're talking about an outside plant build, that may be $7-10 million. That's a pretty standard contract that we see, and we see people go in and they may do a draw every quarter, or they may do a draw a couple times a year to pay that as they go. That is perfectly acceptable. But one of the things I would look at is sitting down with your GFR and looking at the schedule of your events and looking at what's the best way to go through that so that you can do that and breaking it up. It may be, and in most cases, I would think it would be cheaper to do a large project, to bid it as a large project to get somebody to come in versus trying to break that up and people having to rebid that. But that's a case-by-case basis, and you can operate that how you want to. But on our 515 contract, you can draw down on that before the contract is. An awardee may request permission to negotiate an outside plant project in excess of $1 million and/or outside plant contracts funded by RUS funds. Yes, you can request permission to negotiate. And there may be some reasons, and that's one of the things that we just talked about. There may be reasons that it's more cost effective. What we're looking at is, are we utilizing these taxpayer funded projects and dollars in the most efficient manner? And so we want to make sure that we're getting the lowest cost for the best product out there. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't negotiate for specific reasons. And that's where you can work with your GFR on the request and get that into DC for approval, or at least to get feedback on it. And that's the other thing is if you have an idea of how you want to do this, there's nothing to say that you can't submit that request and ask for permission. And if we don't feel that it's in the best interest, then we can deny it. There's no harm in that. How can we account for the purchases of multiple prefabricated shelters, including all site in one 773 contract? So attached to the 773 contract, and this is another one where working with your GFR to talk about that. Attached to the 773 contract, when we went through that, it talked about attaching the drawings, the plans and specs, and all of the things required under the construction procedure guide, that you can do that. Now you can break those up into, if they are multiple sites, you could break those up into multiple 773 contracts. Or if you feel like it's all one project, but just has multiple sites, but it's under the $1 million, then attaching the plans and specs, attaching the documentation, the drawings, the units, and those kind of things to the 773 is the best way to do that, and work with your GFR to make sure that you have everything that's required under the procedures. Is the Buy America certification required for all material purchased, or does it exclude miscellaneous hardware like bolts and strands and clamps? George, do you want to take that one? I'm not sure I've had something to that extent.
I'll take it. I'll take it. Thanks, Shekinah. So Buy American applies to all materials, including bolts, stands, clamps, any material funded with federal funds is subject to Buy American. And we have to be very careful because Buy American also applies to, you have to be very careful, especially on the equipment side, because there are some equipment that cannot even be on your network. So if you are concerned about Buy American, I strongly recommend that you have a discussion with your GFR.
In regards to the 30-day limit for submission of contract closeouts, does contract completion mean the completion of the work under the contract or the certification completion date? My understanding, George, correct me if I'm wrong, but that's the certification completion date, correct?
That is correct. So some of the terms we'd look for in professional services contracts, the engineering contracts, is, and most of our contracts have these provisions that the testing and the certification is done within a very close window to when construction has been completed. And that way, once the testing is done and the engineer is certified that the project's completed, we expect all closeout documents to be submitted within 30 days of that time. I think that answers it.
The timesheets for in-house engineering need hours plus detail of the work performed for those hours to be audited by RUS to meet the terms of the CFR. If you are requesting for reimbursement for in-house engineering, there are a number of things that are required. To get a full list of understanding of that, I would meet with your GFR and your field accountant. But yes, hours and detail of work so that we can relate the reimbursement of that directly to project approved funding, so we can coordinate those two. So we know the hours that you worked on project approved purposes, and be able to tie those hours specifically to approved purposes for audit purposes and for reimbursement purposes. Are all plans and specs required to be performed submitted by a PE license in the work state for buildings, cables, equipment? Let me make sure I read that right. Are all PEs required to be performed submitted by plans and specs, sorry. Are all plans and specs required to be performed submitted by a PE license to work in the state for buildings, cables, and equipment? If you have an in-house engineer and your state does not require a PE, then that can be acceptable. Some states, like Kansas, do not require a PE for telecom. So if you have an in-house engineer that's approved, that's meeting all state requirements, then that in-house engineer can submit the plans and specs. If your state requires a PE for those specific types of purposes, like buildings, then that would be the requirement based upon your individual state. If you're contracting out, I believe we require a certified PE if you're going to a contractor group. If it's an in-house engineer, I believe that we can waive that provision for it to be a PE, but they do have to meet, they do have to provide their qualifications and their resume into DC for approval that they are qualified to oversee that project. George, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
Yes, Shekinah, and this is a very good question because when awardees are electing or selecting engineers who will be preparing the plans and specs, they need to keep in mind that these engineers will also be expected at the back end to do the inspection and certification. So if you have one engineer that's designing and another engineer is going to come in and test against that design, they may have ethical reasons why they will not sign up on designs that they were not involved in preparing. So if you are thinking along those lines, this is you need to have a conversation with your GFR. Let's get program staff involved. Let's start that conversation early, because the engineer either has to be licensed in the state in which facilities are deployed, or it has to be an approved engineer, an engineer that is in-house engineer that's been approved by RUIs.
Thank you, George. Does the request for negotiation of outside plant contracts have to follow plans and specs approval, which requires ER completion?
I'll take that, Chicana.
Okay, yeah,
so that's a very good question. That's a very good question. So we often get this question. This question comes up. The request to negotiate is based on the plans and specs. And so we sometimes will get requests to negotiate, but the foundation for the negotiation has not been approved. So the plans and specs is critical because that forms the basis for the project that is going to be negotiated. We will generally require the plans and specs be approved first, and then based on that, we have the scope defined, and with the plans and specs approval, we've already confirmed that there are no all environmental reviews and requirements are being concluded. Then we can then look at the request to negotiate, look into the contractor, see why negotiation is the path that was selected instead of openly bidding. Is the contractor even debarred from contracting with the federal government? So there's some checks that we do that the program staff will conduct. And if there are concerns, we will certainly involve the awardee and the GFR in follow-up conversations.
Thank you, George. The last question that we have right now is, as a wholly owned subsidiary of an electric cooperative, what contracts or agreements are necessary for them to provide make-ready work on our behalf? So this is where we get into the affiliate transactions, and what is going to be required in order for that to proceed is you'll need to meet with your GFR and go over the affiliate transactions so that they can make sure they get all the right documentation to DC to approve affiliate transactions. There may still be some requirements to ensure that this is the lowest utmost cost-effective process to move forward. Even though it is an affiliate, we still have to verify that it's the most cost-effective for the government and for taxpayer funds. But work with your GFR. This is on affiliate transactions, and they can walk you through the process. And with that, we have gone over our time. If you have any additional questions, or there was something that was very specific that you wanted to ask, but you weren't sure because it's key to your project, like I said, you can schedule office hours with your GFR or with the appropriate individuals that can help you through this. I mean, you can also set up a meeting with your GFR if your conversation is going to take a lot longer. Start setting up meetings and requesting meetings with your GFR. I know there's a couple of my borrowers that I meet with weekly or bi-weekly to kind of go over some of this stuff. So don't hesitate to reach out to your GFR with any questions, concerns. Start working on this, because while we're going through the environmental clearance, this is a good time to really nail down the planning process so that once you get that release of funds, you can shoot out of the gate. And with that, I will thank you all for your time and attendance of this session, and I wish you all a great day.